As I said, I'm going to begin talking again so that we never forget and keep constantly in our minds animal research or research on animals, using animals virtually and functionally to the same effect and way as we would use a pencil sharpener for a pencil were it to be sharpened. We need a brain, we need a body, we need something to test blood products on, we need something to grow tumors in, we need something to give a virus to, or we need to harvest culture specimens, and so we need living organisms, and animals happen to be there for the taking, as they have been throughout history, and so they end up getting used in laboratories. Animals are bred for this purpose in vast and great numbers, from rats to breeds of dogs and pigs and any number of animals, farm animals and so on, as well as animals are caught in the wild, sometimes taken legally, other times taken illegally, and shipped to research centers domestically and from all over the world. And they end up in pretty hapless fates. Animals are also landed into laboratories by virtue of being sold in clandestine ways. Even though, of course, this is against the law, there are situations where people can make some extra cash by passing animals on. There are laws against this, but passing animals along that they either capture or get possession of by virtue of them having been captured off the street and so on, and pass them along to laboratories. So lucky for us that we're not animals, and there are laws against humans being impounded, if you will, and taken to the laboratory and being researched on, although people who are in prison often have effective kinds of situations put on them where they're involved in research because they get some benefits by participating in that research. So being in a kind of captive situation, there is a kind of containment that they find themselves in that ends up that they become subjects of research. But of course, the restrictions on what is done to humans is far more severe and serious than what is done to animals. Now, there are many kinds of research committees and research committees on which there are government personnel, university personnel, and also outside citizen personnel to purview and see what's going on in research and kind of supervise so that it adheres to what laws we do have in place. But even given the guidelines that we have to follow, which people who belong to organizations that fight for animals and for their not being researched on, even given those laws, the things that can be done to an animal are still brutally severe, even when the best care is taken. Even experiments that deal with animal pain and researching on pain itself, where animals have to be put in pain, is allowed, or research where animals are made terribly ill by virtue of what the research is about and have to go through that sickness. And the thing about animal research, unlike eating animals, is that one fell swoop to the head and the animal is dead. In the case of an animal being taken for food, for example, is not the case of an animal in research. An animal in research is subject to being in a cage, is subject to being in a laboratory environment, a hermetically sealed environment, is subject to space restrictions, is often separated from other animals because of the nature of how the lab is kept and the nature of the research. The animal is subject to being handled for purposes of whatever needs to be done. The subject is an object, and a very pitiful object at that. I mean, none of us would want to be in that kind of a circumstance. And I've seen that recently the Animal Liberation Front, which goes into laboratories or breaks into laboratories to try to rescue animals or free them, is apparently even stepping up its activity more and has put out a video or two which was done while a break-in was happening, showing how they opened cages and broke the door down to get in and so forth and so on, and they're getting more militant all the time. Now, even though violence is not an answer to anything, the answers of medical researchers to such break-ins, or even to people who just politely and with great civility protest animal research, is that the research must go on because it's important work and medicine must move forward. Well, this is the point that I wanted to take special note of today, that the idea of having to keep doing this and not listening to how miserable and how suffering and what an infliction of pain and cruelty this is de facto on animals is very alarming to hear, juxtaposed to statements that say we must keep doing this because this is very important work. The proof of this is only where the people who must keep doing this and take this to be such important work would just stop and say, let themselves become the subjects, let themselves be the persons who would be in the cages, the ones who would be getting the injections, the ones who would be being made ill, the ones who would serve as things to be used, to be looked at, to be analyzed, to be handled, to be transected, to infected, and so on, to understand why a statement that it must continue to be done for the sake of medicine when one who is doing it is not suffering any of what it would be to be at the receiving end of this, why it sounds like such a ineffective and wrong statement to be making. People who do research sometimes argue that privately held animals like a dog in an apartment is no better than a dog in a laboratory. A dog in an apartment has a master that comes home to it at least at the end of the day, just the way humans come home to their children at the end of the day and recognize them to some degree, pet them and handle them and love them to some degree, and are in a social relationship, are not keeping them sequestered somewhere to cut them and measure their vital signs and watch the progress of some terrible condition that they have to endure from an experimental perspective. That's the difference. Even though we can understand some objections to keeping animals housed in apartments when they're left there for long periods of time or left unattended, there is qualitatively no comparison whatsoever to being a pet animal in a decent circumstance and being a laboratory animal in a decent or indecent circumstance. In fact, if people at home were doing a fraction to an animal of what by formal sanction is done to an animal in a laboratory, they most often could be arrested for doing that same kind of activity in a home. And some people say now, too, that doing research on animals is a career, and that people get used to it, they get into the career aspect of it, and they overlook the suffering, and it's the careerism that precludes them from seeing. But I think to do research to an extent, one would have to be somewhat insensitive to suffering, to empathy, to sympathy. No, not by saying in your mind you know how hard it is and you take precautions and it's too bad, but we do need these things for science. No, by true empathy of volunteering oneself or understanding that the animals feel pain, humans feel pain, all beings that live feel pain, and it's identical as far as the feeling and the sentience of being in that circumstance of being that hapless animal as it would be as if it were oneself. And who among us would volunteer to undergo that kind of desecration? And is it not the case that not only might we not be insensitive, and we can't imagine what we don't see if we're not in the laboratories, just like if we're not in human prisons, if we're not in animal laboratories, if we don't see it in front of our very eyes, it's out of sight, out of mind. We can't imagine what it's like for these animals. We're just not attuned to think about it. And people are highly sensitive to things happening to animals in the real world. They can't bear the sight for the most part, many people. So it's just an unawareness because it's not part of most people's daily routine. But there could also be in persons who are insensitive to this in the sense that they may not volunteer their children for such things, but they would volunteer animals. They may not volunteer themselves. There can be in our psyche, and we know there is in all of our psyches, some degree of enjoying or not only being insensitive, but finding the infliction of pain and suffering no problem, or perhaps even a matter of favorableness to oneself. This is possible. We have to think of all these possibilities. And then we have the fact that people working in laboratories towards medical goals, towards the betterment of human life and so forth and so on. And what is human life if it is not moral, if it is not sensitive to pain and suffering, if it does not inflict pain and suffering beyond the bare minimum of what is truly necessary in life, not for some pie in the sky or theoretical or experimental value, so to speak. There's also the situation of people being involved in business. It's a very big business to do biomedical research. It's very big business to have options in a company, stock options and so on. And this is a very big motivator as well. Biotechnology is an extremely hot area. Whether animals can get us to a better life for humans and great medical cures, so to speak, figuratively speaking, is a very open question, and that's extremely susceptible to great debate, and I won't even begin to get into that. But the medical issue of whether this is even the way to go about our health and welfare and medicine is totally separate from the fact that animals feel pain and that animals suffer greatly, and that it's immoral to be inflicting this kind of suffering on creatures that have no wherewithal except to endure it. For reasons of extraordinarily vigorous and rich business enterprise and enrichment and profit and many other complicated motivations, often rationalized or promoted or secularized, commercialized, propagandized, advertised, conditioned, worn in as important to science, good for people, cures for cancer, winning the battles against biology, etc., etc., etc. In other words, that is a separate issue, the issue of medicine, how to go about it, and whether going about it this way can ever be truly fruitful in and of itself. That's a separate issue to be debated. And the other, more fundamental, right before us issue is that animals feel pain and suffer greatly, and it's a mammoth insensitivity to take life and use it this way, when in fact, for example, one could volunteer oneself if it were that urgent and that necessary a sacrifice to make. And I often say, too, that separately from what I've just said, that let's assume for the sake of petty argument that all of our ills would be cured, which is, believe me, is not a possibility. That all of our ills would be cured on the backs of using animals and all their suffering and laboratory camp experience. It cannot be done. It cannot be accepted. Not that it would ever happen, but in theory, for petty argument's sake, were it to happen, it cannot be accepted. No way can this be accepted. Now, before I started the show, talking with persons in the studio, I got some questions from them, and some of them were pertinent to the animal question, so I think I will look at one of them, which was, don't you think that animal research could lead to life-saving medical discoveries and already has? And I think the person also noted in conjunction with this question that there was some new breakthrough in the fight against, the so-called fight against multiple sclerosis. Oh, there are so many ways to fight for health, and I'm not sure that some of our technical ways of fighting for health are even as advantageous as we might in the abstract tend to automatically think or be conditioned to think. But regarding specifically multiple sclerosis, certainly this is a dread disease, and people who have it can have it from mild forms to moderate to very severe, and it can even be a fatal illness, and it often goes from mild to worse. There is at the present time no cure for multiple sclerosis, nor is there cure for many and most of the major dread diseases, nor has there been historically, through laboratory research specifically, cures for major diseases in general, generally speaking. That is not how science has made its so-called progress, and in the end, all kinds of medicines and techniques have to be practiced, so to speak, on humans. We have a call coming in. Let us take the call.
Hello?
Hello.
How you doing, Nancy? Long-time fan, first-time caller. My question for you is, if one animal life could save 1 million human lives, would it be worth it to you?
Great question. I would say no to that question, and let me put it to you the other way.
Okay.
Sometimes we talk about millions of animals suffering, and we say, gee, if we could just reduce the number of animals, or even people, in terms of suffering, anything that lives and can suffer, okay? We say like an earthquake is really bad because 1,000 people died. It's not as bad as if 15 people died. Or we say certain kind of cancer is really bad because 1 million people get it every year versus 5 people. Similarly with animals, we say if only not so many, or if it wasn't on such a large scale. And philosophically, I say just one animal taken, one human taken, one baby taken, one animal taken, and have something toxic put into its skin or into its eyes and put in a cage, that pure, think of it, beautiful rabbit that any child that's feeling free and life-hood would just run over to that rabbit and want to see it and pet it, and it's such a beautiful thing. And we make Easter bunnies and we make chocolate candies of bunnies and we show them on ads with their puffy tails. There it is, whole and pure. And you take that whole and pure creature in all its glory, and you take it and you desecrate it and you put poison in it and you ruin its eyes and you cause great pain and suffering. Just one is enough. One is as much as 1 million. One is as much as the whole world.
Okay, now the second follow-up question I have is, I've listened to many of your speeches and I have no idea what you're talking about ever. It's very incomprehensible, and that's my only comment.
Well,
thank you very much for your time, Nancy.
You're welcome. At least you've listened is all I can say to that, to know that they're incomprehensible. But I hope that you can get the point that one is the equivalent of 1 million. It doesn't matter. One life desecrated is like all life desecrated. I'm not a religious person, but I like to draw the analogy, for example, to Jesus Christ, who died on the cross, in the sense that just that one person's suffering is enough for people around the world for generations to take lessons from and inspiration from and belief from. Just one person suffering what is not even the most by far that other human beings in this life have had to suffer. There was once a girl who was put in an electric stove by her parents, a 6-year-old girl, not too many years ago, and burned to death that way. And all kinds of horrors have been inflicted on people. So, but you can see that just one is worth all, and all is worth the one. So the arguments in this case of reducing numbers, by the way, which is also another argument made, that if we can bring the numbers down, we're doing great things. We won't be doing any great things till we don't bastardize and desecrate life. So, and previously to the phone call, I was talking about whether research saves life, cures things, and so on. And I was saying that we ultimately have to use people. People are the ultimate guinea pigs, and hopefully we could have, in a more qualitatively human society, we could have good relations with physicians and other kinds of healthcare providers, and they could try things with us on a trusting basis if we didn't have the mess that we have in a modern life of untrusting relations, fast meetings with people in healthcare and any other profession, so that we have to have many other ways of validating and assuring, hopefully, that what we're going under is not going to harm us or is in our best interest. But ideally, in better cultures that are designed better and more for human welfare, we would be in trusting relationships, and we could be trying things in medicine as they are in effect anyway. All these new procedures, new drugs, they're all clinically tried in human trials, and even when they're approved and on the commercial market use, they are still effectively being tried on people and constantly being honed and made more sophisticated or even discarded. And as the process to approve things gets speeded up, we're going to see more causes for things to turn out not quite as well as we might have anticipated when they are first introduced. Now, someone else has asked, what motivates you, and why do you feel so strongly about animal rights? I think the first question about what motivates me was set with the idea of why do I bother to talk about all the things that I talk about all the time in general anyway. And I talk about them because they're on my mind and they are the kinds of things that I think. So I think, therefore I am, and I go right ahead and talk them out to you on this show and in other venues. We might as well have some meaning to life. We might as well be talking and acting and doing something for some purpose. I think a lot of the reasons that might motivate people certainly motivate me too. I mean, I like to eat. I like to, fix myself in certain ways, have certain style, if you will. I like to, have certain amounts of comfort and aesthetic environment around myself. But all in all, none of that is anywhere near enough to give purpose. That alone can't possibly give purpose to life. So I think, in a sense, I'm probably looking for purpose, and some of the things that go through my mind and are on my mind are what propel me to come forward and talk aloud about them. And why do I feel so strongly about animal rights? I love animals. I also love music, for example, but I love animals. And when you just look at an animal, if you are an animal lover, you just love that animal. Now, I know Yvonne, the person on camera right here, has 2 kitty cats of her own, and I bet she loves those kitty cats to pieces, and she's nodding in agreement. And Lita Booth, the director, and AA Video Productions, has both a dog and a cat, and her doggie is not so well behaved. And her kitty is very well behaved, and she loves them to death. She just loves, you can't help it. You look at them, you want to hold them, you want everything to be good for them. And you see other animals, they just elicit out of you awe and inspiration and reciprocity and comfort, and the animals have great things to show us in how they are. I don't want to be technical about this, but when you watch them, a whole world is open to you. They're not just animals. They're extremely shrewd, and they're extremely unique in the kind of creatures that they are, and how they get by and how they relate. And animals relate. Even animals that you might think have no capacity to be in some kind of communication with other creatures and with humans can even be shown to relate if you look close enough. But when you're an animal lover, you don't need proof of why these things are so. You don't need proof of why you shouldn't experiment on animals. In fact, it's very painful that anyone would have to go through such lengths to try to articulate why we shouldn't research on animals or why we should like them. It just is. And more people like animals than don't like animals. And when bad things happen to animals and come to the public view, the public gets very upset and responds accordingly. I remember once some second graders were on a trip to watch whales in the ocean, and a mother whale was with a baby whale, and the mother whale got hit by a boat while they were watching. And the children were taking fits when they saw this. They were beyond themselves. They got into a cataleptic state practically from seeing the mama whale get hurt. So there is something innate and intrinsic in feeling for animals. It can be proven too. All these things can be proven and can be shown, but like I say, they go without saying, really. Just as in our preamble that says we have inalienable rights as human beings goes without saying, similarly, and I see I have a phone call coming in, so does the intrinsic beauty and validity of animals. Let's take the phone call.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, I was wondering, what is a humane way to get rid of mice? We just found mice in our apartment the other day, so we started going out buying traps and stuff like that. They haven't even seemed to work yet, and then we were just thinking, I don't want to kill these things like that because then we have to clean them up, so what should we do?
Right. Good point. Yeah, well, Yvonne is saying get some cats here to take care of. That is a great idea. That's what cats were used for on the farms. But also once, I believe I saw what's called humane traps for mice, where they get trapped in a housing. They don't get killed, but they get trapped in something that contains them, and then you have to go and, let them out in a field somewhere. Does that make sense to you, caller? Are you still there? Did the person hang up? The person hung up. Yeah, I don't know if that's still on the market, but there was something made for humanely catching mice. And I guess it captures them in like a cage or whatever, and then you have to take them somewhere. I remember once in a basement we found some kind of semi-rodent that looked like some of those creatures out of fantasy science fiction books. They're sort of like mice, and they have the mice tails, but they have these sort of bigger elephant kind of ears. They're small little creatures, and this creature would just sit. It was like a fantasy thing. We found it, and when everybody was looking at it, what is it? It would just sit there like this, very quietly. And we removed it, and someone brought it to a field. I never saw a creature like that in my whole life. And the other thing is, too, that you have to be very careful. If you live in an apartment, you've got to hopefully work with your landlord on this, or you've got to be very careful to protect any possible little openings in your home or in your basement for mice to get in. They're very adept at getting into the smallest little cracks, and of course if food is left around, you're inviting them in too. So those are other things to be watching out for. And then of course we all know why the mouse left home, the baby mouse. We know why he left home on his own, and that was because he found out that his father was a rat. Now someone else has asked a question of what rights do animals have? Inasmuch as you see people protesting and saying animal rights, he's wondering, where is it written that animals have rights? Where's the Constitution for this, or is there one? And then he was thinking of a country like India, where animals are respected and revered and adored, although India is becoming very westernized, so to speak, or very technologicalized, if you will. And many of the practices we do here are done by a lot of people there. But the traditional India was very reverential to animals. And as you might know, cows were not eaten. In fact, snakes and rats could even be creatures worthy of reverence in certain sects and certain areas of India. So how can you say animals have rights? I mean, where are these rights found? What exactly does it mean? Well, truly speaking, animals have very few rights in the law. And sometimes if you see court TV, and people are in court because some harm came to one of the parties' animals, and they want some recompense, not just for medical bills, but sometimes for pain and suffering. The judge will say, no, there's no recompense for that because animals are considered property, so you can't get anything for pain and suffering that they might have undergone. And there was a time, by the way, that females were considered property in English law and in common law until not so very long ago. But animals are, and in some African law for that matter, come to think of it, and the Indian law for that matter, but even today. But animals continue to be chattel in the law. However, there is a growing amount of law around this issue, and people are at work trying to refine and make more concrete the rights of animals. There certainly are rights regarding cruelty to animals. You can't, and the ironic thing about that is that a lot of the things that you would do that could be considered cruel as a private citizen or as a non-science practicing laboratory person would not be considered cruel if they were sanctioned practices as part of an experiment. And this is the great dilemma and the great irony that the same kind of things that can be called okay to do because they are labeled science, so to speak, would be labeled not okay to do when they're just labeled nothing in particular, just ordinary citizen activity. So you can't be cruel to animals, and then there are laws about how animals are treated in circumstances such as racing and other kinds of commercial enterprises. And these kinds of laws are getting expanded, and I'm sure there's more to it than I'm mentioning right now, but suffice that to say that right now. Also, there are rules and regulations from the federal government coming out of the United States Department of Agriculture, coming out of the National Institutes of Health, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and other science directorates, all historically involved in providing guidelines on the care and use of animals in either laboratories or in shipping them or in having them in circuses or whatever. So, and those rules and regulations are growing all the time, and through the hard work of people like the Animal Protection Legislative Society and many other organizations, these kinds of restrictions on what can happen to animals are getting more tight and more comprehensive all the time. And we would nowhere be near, for the most part, some of the restrictions and guidelines that we do have in place right now were it not for people pushing constantly, trying to make more rules or more law for the protection of animals who, unlike ourselves, can't go to court and sue somebody for what they might have done to them, cannot use the English language and are therefore handicapped, and cannot have their families look after them or any such thing that we have as privileges of being human.
Dr. Mroczek now discusses other questions submitted to her as well as current events regarding corporations and the grip of mega-corporate concerns on the little individual.
Just briefly today, I'm going to touch on another question that was brought up before the show. It's a question that I was filled in about the information on it. I don't know the specific instance that's being referred to, but it's a broader question, kind of bearing on the rights of people to practice religion as they see fit, I guess. And I'm going to just briefly tackle this following the time constraints of where we are in the show, because any other subject at this point would be too much to get started on at the present moment. I would just say very briefly, the question was that some persons who live in a housing complex here in Boston known as Bromley Heath were disallowed to have a church facility on the complex grounds because it's a public housing complex, and it was said that there has to be a separation of church and state, and so the church part of it was forced to close. Now, I don't know if the church was a specific physical structure or if it was just people meeting in a way that was like a formal grouping of people, but I would say this about that, which is so many people are pushing to have their religious practices or their religious ideas represented in school, or in this case in the complex, or to be able to enact them or to practice them in places where they might be prohibited due to the separation of church and state. And I would just say briefly that if religion could be looked upon as just another idea, just another matter of speech, just being able to say things that you believe or practice things that you believe, nothing more, nothing less. If it were not being coerced onto people that they have to behave in a certain way or adhere to what is being said, or also if it were not coerced to people that they could not challenge what is being said or treat it like any other free speech, then perhaps it would be okay to be permitting all these so-called religious kinds of speech to be in places where people feel like having them to be. That's how I look at the topic in a very superficial way, a very cursory way in answer to that question. And maybe we can, as people over time, evolve into a system that has room for all things to be expressed merely as any number of ideas. Now, when these ideas start to take on vicissitudes of being sacred, of being untouchable, of being necessary, of being the law for other people who aren't part of the belief system, then we're in a whole other ball game whatsoever, if that's how the issue becomes. I'd also like to touch on two things coming out of current events having to do with corporate United States, and I often talk on corporations and would like to continue to elaborate on that over time into the future. Corporations, the corporate culture that we are living under, and what this means to us, and what this means to life and individuality, freedom, humanness, and so on. Two things coming down the pike in current events is, one, in this past week, the Congress repealed what is known as the Glass-Steagall Act from many years ago, which separated the business of brokerage houses and banks and mostly those two, I believe, from interchanging their businesses, from enmeshing their businesses and not having dividing lines between them. Maybe insurance companies were also part of that division at the time that law was put into effect, but there were firewalls between all these different categories of business so that they could not be mingling their enterprises. Well, now that law has been repealed, and that means that insurance companies and brokerages and banks can conglomerate their activities and work under one umbrella as businesses with these different functions. And there was a program on this, one of many, on C-SPAN, where a Democratic representative, I believe named Tim Johnson, came on because he was a member of the overseeing committee in Congress, and he spoke on behalf of repealing this act, which made for the inter-involvement of these kinds of businesses. And I watched the show almost for its entirety, and during that show, every caller that I saw, be it on a liberal line, a conservative line, or a moderate, so to speak, really libertarian maybe, or moderate line, three lines they have in, every person was absolutely against such a law being repealed and a new one being enacted that allowed the enmeshment of these three kinds of businesses into each other. People said, we've already seen what the mergers of banks are doing. The mergers of banks are giving us less service, charging us more fees. We also know the bigger the banks get, the less they care about small loans, the less they have policies. People have testified of giving out loans. The more financial worth they can look to be playing with when they're dealing with entities within their system. People said, what about privacy? This means companies in different aspects of what I need them to do business with me for are going to know things about me that formerly they didn't know, and they will conglomerate and begin to know absolutely everything, know as much about me as I do in my private knowledge of myself, who I am, what my assets are, and so forth and so on. People criticized, and the representative was not moved by this whatsoever. He just half smiled politely and was determined to move ahead with allowing these businesses to be in combination with each other. So that is what was delivered to the people of the United States this week from the Congress. And of course, the President, Mr. Bill Clinton, signed that new act. So we are going to see new kinds of contingencies on ourselves in terms of privacy, in terms of possibilities to accumulate control and dictate terms even more vertically down to the person at the receiving end, the little entity at the final end of big business. That's what's in store for us from this most unpopular, for those who even heard about it, most unpopular act. Secondly, we know that there are revolts against the so-called second charge of an ATM fee when you're taking money out of an ATM which is not an ATM of your primary bank. And I guess a couple of cities or towns, some in California, have passed laws prohibiting this so-called second charge. And I could not be more in agreement. I'm not sure that doing it by law is the way to do it, because that's a very tricky issue, to have the government come in and make the rules of how a business operates, in that sense of how much it's allowed to charge. But certainly consumers should be spending their efforts to go towards the banks that don't charge these fees, and making their voices heard, and complaining and telling the banks, and walking into the banks and calling the banks and writing statements to the banks, and talking to each other about this instead of passively accepting. Now my position is even further. Why is anyone ever charged any money to take money out of an ATM, even a nickel to take money out of an ATM? If ATMs cost money to operate, and if that's the excuse for charging these fees, which are way in excess of what it takes to operate these machines, don't introduce the machines to begin with. Don't introduce a technology that's going to make it more expensive for the customer, and don't start the customer out on a technology which is free to begin with, and then you try to find ways to charge money. Most fundamentally in this issue is, think of the principle, first charge, second charge, any charge. Think of the principle, no pun intended. It's your money, and you're having to pay to get your money. This is an unheard of fundamental principle. It's your money, and you have to pay to get your hands on your money. And these conglomerations, such as the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act that I just mentioned to you, will bring more pressures against your basic human rights and welfare. And your mind should be thinking, your head should be percolating, your heart should be pumping, and you should be aware and know what is fundamentally in your best interest and in all people's best interest, to have a more humane society, and not just one where you're at the receiving end of being some kind of sucker consumer who merely constantly is trying to burrow him or herself out of the deeper holes and pressures and stresses of keeping up in the rat race and passively paying. So let's just be more involved in the politics of daily experience, the politics of living, more energized to be more purposeful and meaningful, and knowing of who we are, where we're going, why we do what we do, and what kind of things are in our best interest, in all people's best interest, in a whole interest for us to be living in the best way possible, not in the most pressured and passive and default way that we are living now, much to many of ours great dissatisfaction. Good evening to you. AA Video Productions, helping me out tonight, can be reached at 522-6531. Good evening. Don't go away. More information and announcements coming up. A two-song original music CD, which I have put in Newberry Comics and Tower. Information available on my web address as well, coming up. A collection of essays called The Psychology of Human Life, with information available at my web address, coming up. The names and addresses of organizations that help animals, coming up. Here's my web address.
Get your paper and pencil and take it down, please, and pay my web address a visit. The song you're listening to is an original by me, called Aesthetic Style. That was members of my band, all from Berklee College of Music.
What do we know? Nothing. Nothing. Zero. 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 What do we know?
Here's the first
What can we
address for
know?
animals who are suffering. The International Primate Protection League, Box 766, Somerville, South Carolina, 29484. If you miss this address, you can check my web address and give me a call, and I will supply you with further information. A second address is the Society for Protective Animal Legislation, Box 3719, Georgetown Station, Washington, D.C. 20007. There's a telephone number as well, 202-337-2334. These organizations do not require you to send them money. You can if you wish. They always need it. But mostly they need you to help in your letter-writing campaign for all these situations that affect animals who are suffering terribly. Please note any upcoming performances. Again, my web address, and thanks to AA Video, Ms. Lita Bruce, who helped me to tape my show.